I do believe that it's important to focus on what I call common mistakes. So, common mistakes refer not just to common mistakes that English learners globally make, but specifically common mistakes made by speakers of your language. So, for any given language A, there will be specific mistakes that are made by almost all learners of another given language B.
Hello, hello, language lovers. Welcome back to LingoCast, the podcast of your language journey. My name is Eliseu, and today we have a very special guest here. So it's been a while since I've met him, and yeah, and I really want to hear a lot of things from him. We had a lot of different and interesting conversations, and today you guys can also get to know him a little bit better. But before starting this episode, don't forget to follow us on social media and in your favorite podcast platform. And if you want to support our project, you can be part of our Patreon program. And yeah, once done with that, we can start talking with David. How are you doing, David?
I'm doing great, Eliseu. Thank you for having me on the show.
Yeah, awesome. I'm very happy to talk to you today because we talked a little bit about different topics, but we didn't go so deep about them. But I noticed that you had a lot of interesting things to say, and today I would like to get to know more about your opinions, your methods. But before, I want to know, who is David? Like, what's your story, and how did you get interested in languages?
Oh, well, that is a long story, I would say, but it started when I was a kid. My mother taught me and my brothers to read when we were very young, at 3 years of age. So I started reading and enjoying literature from a very young age. But I only grew up speaking English, and languages, foreign languages, were a bit of a black box. It was something magical when people spoke a language that I didn't understand. And it wasn't until later in middle school in the United States, depending on where you go to school, you don't necessarily get the opportunity to start learning foreign languages from a young age, at least when I was growing up. So I didn't actually start learning languages until I was about 12 in the sixth grade, starting with French and then later with Spanish. And eventually I got to German, which is now my strongest language. And that's also the language that I teach, especially after living 15 years in Germany. It's pretty much a second mother tongue, I would say, at this point. But it all started, as I said, with the love of the written word and literature. And then that kind of organically grew into a love of all things language related, I would
Hmm.
say.
So you had all these languages in school in the US?
I did, although I do have to admit that I started learning French in sixth grade. Then I quit after about a semester because I found it. I would say it was primarily the traditional teaching methods, so grammar-based teaching methods, memorization of vocab lists, things like that. That didn't really jive with me. And then the year thereafter, I started with Spanish, same thing. And it wasn't until I started to learn German, and I didn't really understand why I enjoyed it more, but later in retrospect, I realized that it was because the focus was on media. So compelling input, things like videos, songs, things like that, and also communication, as opposed to there being a focus primarily on grammar, as had been the case for the other languages. So that's why I really got into it and kind of stuck with it, and that eventually led to a great deal of success, which then transferred back over to those other languages that I had quit. And I ended up learning Spanish and French in addition to a number of other languages as well.
Awesome. And I want to know, how did you end up in Germany?
Well, I studied German in my first bachelor program. I went to the University of Berkeley in California. And as part of the program, you have to study abroad for at least one semester. I ended up doing a whole year. And at the time, the program offered two options. One was Berlin, and the other one was Göttingen. I'm not sure. Have you ever heard of Göttingen before in Germany?
I heard the name, but no idea where it is.
Okay, well, it's smack dab in the middle of Germany, as we say. It's not too far away from Hanover, and it's very famous for a number of reasons, but it's a pretty good university and a lovely little town. But it ended up being the right choice because most of the people who went to Berlin ended up speaking a lot of English because there are a great deal of not only native English speakers, but just people who speak English as the lingua franca in general in Berlin, as opposed to Göttingen, where you kind of can have the small town German speaking experience if you want. So I ended up going there and immersing myself entirely in the German language to the point where I only spoke English maybe once a month when I would speak to my family. And otherwise, I effectively attempted to become German and succeeded in that um, objective to a certain degree, such that my success with the German language actually led to a great deal of opportunities that I otherwise would not have had I not actually, gone to the lengths necessary to achieve that level of intensity of learning.
We'll talk a little bit about your German and also about the US and English once it's your mother tongue. But I want to know, when I started learning German, we had almost no content in Portuguese, like my mother tongue. And I think in
Hmm.
Spanish also I couldn't find. And I
Hmm.
think would be very useful. Maybe not because actually I end up learning English as well, but why did you decide to create courses for Spanish speaking people in to learn German?
That really was a bit of coincidence, I would say. I would say that when I first started out, I was just creating content in English for people who were learning German. And relatively quickly, but I was also doing videos in Spanish. And relatively quickly, well, in 2019, I had the pleasure of meeting a gentleman by the name of Martin from Peru. He's got a YouTube channel called Jardín de Martín. And I met him, and it turned out that he was a content creator, obviously a Spanish speaker living in Germany. And he messaged me and said, "Hey, could I interview you on your method?" And yeah, I think it's really interesting, and especially the fact that it's a bilingual method, and I think that it would help out a lot of people. And so he ended up interviewing me for his channel, and that video has been watched about 100,000 times at this point. And I'm constantly getting messages. And shortly thereafter that started, I started just getting messages all the time from Spanish speakers saying, "Hey, I would love to learn with your method because I've tried to learn German so many times. I've bought books, especially gone to courses in Germany, but there's never translations in Spanish. If there's any translations at all, they're in English, but my English is not good enough. And so I end up trying and failing over and over and over again, and I'm really frustrated." And so, I got the same kind of messages so often that eventually I realized that there was a giant market for individuals who speak Spanish and would like to improve their German. And I love speaking Spanish. I lived in Spain for 2 years, and my dad's wife is from Mexico, so I definitely have a connection to the Spanish language and Spanish speakers in general. And there's a certain kind of joy that you get from working with Latinos in general, including Brazilians, by the way. I mean, they're just very, very open about how much they appreciate what it is that you do, and that's just something lovely that you get back from the community of people that you work with.
That's something really interesting you said, because I think that usually we just assume that everyone speaks English, but that's not true. Actually, like in Brazil, I think 1 or 2% of population speaks English. So having this thought, it's really nice to give this opportunity to someone who doesn't speak English to learn another language. So yeah, I hadn't thought about that. It's definitely something really nice, and the Spanish speaking market is huge, as we know. From in Brazil or in Latin America in general, you have such a cultural bubble where you
Mm,
have like people who are so famous, content that it's so big, but no one knows out of there. I think nowadays, especially Spanish speaking, is getting more popular. Pop culture is getting from the series and from the music. Reggaeton is
mhm,
worldwide nowadays, but
mhm.
we still have a huge market that does not speak English and sometimes does not consume so much content from in English. So I think it was a very good call. And also from the US, I always heard that US people do not speak languages. But on the other hand, I have met so many amazing polyglots from the United States. And how, like like you, for example, how do you explain that? Like, what happens in the US that you have so many US polyglots and goes completely against the stereotype?
Yeah. That is also something that I have heard many times, and it's a reason why I'm constantly surprising people when they, of course, they hear you speak with an American accent. English speakers in general, I would say, on average, tend to speak less languages, and that's perhaps unfair, but that's definitely a stereotype that does exist. But especially if you speak with an American accent, then people just assume you don't speak any other languages. But I think that it has to do with the fact that the very fact that very few Americans, perhaps traditionally or historically, would go out of their way to learn languages, that you have then some individuals that then go to the opposite extreme and just absolutely go crazy. It's something like one of the best tools for language learning, and one of the main tools that I use with my students, for example, that I've been using for more than 10 years, is Anki, which I'm sure you've used before and talked with other people about before. Well, that was created by an English native speaker, an Australian guy who was trying to learn Japanese, right? It's not like he was just trying to learn Spanish, but he was trying to learn arguably one of the most difficult languages. So he needed to go to a certain extreme, let's say, in order to do that. And I think that's essentially what's happening in a European environment. Many times you're surrounded by languages. It's not that magical, perhaps, to learn languages. Whereas if you come from a monolingual English speaking background like I do, and then you get into languages, then you go absolutely bonkers, because it's just something that is amazing. And I think that trend absolutely is growing, especially now that people are seeing that there are other Americans who are doing this and who can do it, who can achieve, this level of polyglottery.
That's amazing. And you said about this, that it's so comfortable. Um, the fact that you in the US everyone speaks English, you don't need to use other languages. And but like in Brazil as well, people, we are always speaking only Portuguese. But on the other hand, we do not have the advantage that if we travel, we cannot use Portuguese unless we go to Portugal. But as an English native speaker, you can travel, and it's people are always adapting to you because they speak your language, right? So it's, you're really inside this comfort zone. And for me, I really appreciate the fact that people really want to get out of this comfort zone, because getting out
Mhm.
of comfort zone is not something easy. It's not something that everyone want to do. So I really appreciate when I see people, the English speakers, that want to learn different languages and get to know different cultures, because you could easily live in your English speaking bubble forever. You have like a
Mhm.
huge amount of content about anything you want,
Yeah.
and you would not need maybe different languages, but you get out of the comfort zone, and it's really, really nice.
That is very, very true. And it's funny, just talking about comfort zones. It reminded me, I lived in Beijing in China for a year and studied Mandarin there. And the interesting thing was, talking about the fact that people don't always necessarily speak English very well. Well, the great majority of the people who I was studying with were Italian, and they did not necessarily speak English. And then a lot of our classmates were from Korea, they were from Japan, and they also didn't speak English very well either. So the lingua franca actually ended up being Chinese. So you would walk down the hallway and you would see this Italian guy speaking to this Japanese girl, and they'd be speaking to each other in Chinese. And it was just, it didn't matter. After months of seeing it, it was still just a kind of funny but very, very cool thing. And it would have been, because they were all students of Chinese, that was actually their comfort zone. So speaking in English actually would have been going outside of their comfort zone. So it's funny because it's just always a kind of relative thing. But you're absolutely right. The danger is that you stay within English speaking communities, English speaking bubbles. And a lot of people do that. And that's why I didn't go to Berlin to study German, but rather went to a smaller town, because I was afraid of precisely that happening.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's really interesting. And also, it reminds me of a conversation we had about Brazilian Portuguese. that I was telling it about how different it is the Portuguese that people learn in comparison with the Portuguese that we actually speak between us, the Brazilians. Do you
Hmm.
think that in English you have the same thing? Like when you hear foreigners, you say like, "Wow, we were learning that," but no one says this kind of things. No one speak like that. No one uses this kind of expressions. Do you have the same feeling like I had when I was explaining that to you, or no? Like it's foreigners speak more accurate.
So you're saying the discrepancy between what you learn in books to learn English versus how people actually talk on the street?
Yeah, or how when you hear foreigners in comparison with how, because I have this theory that English is is an exception when it comes to languages because it exists this international English. Like I work in a company that everyone is speaking English, but no one is a native speaker.
Okay.
So, and we probably use a different language, perhaps you can tell me, than
Hmm.
actually native speakers use. So it's like
Hmm.
English leaves another life because I believe languages are alive, but not only in the native speaking zone as a
Yeah.
second language. So do you
Mhm.
feel that it's very different how you talk with your friends, your family, than when you hear foreigners talking? Like, what? It's a different language.
Uh, well, it does entirely depend on the level of the foreigners. I often talk to people about what where acquisition comes from. That is to say, how is it that we actually pick up languages? And there are obviously many different theories about this, and there are many different ways of acquiring a language. But if you look at the non-native speakers of English who speak English at the highest level or among the highest level, then you immediately think of people from where? People from the Netherlands and from Scandinavia. And the reason why they speak English at such a high level is because they watch English television in English with subtitles in their language. So they have understandable, comprehensible input, right? And movies as well, right? And they do that from a very young age. So when you talk about foreigners, non-native speakers, you have to kind of be a little bit careful because I've met people from the Netherlands who I thought were native speakers of English, but in fact they were not. But they had grown up just like I did, effectively hearing so much English on TV and in movies that they could speak in a way that sounded, quasi native, right? But you are right that, if you have a wide range of different levels in a company, for example, like the one that you work for, then you're also going to have a very, very wide range of abilities with regard to the English language. And the biggest difference between the way that non-native speakers speak and native speakers speak is a vocabulary usage. So the total amount of vocabulary that is used, as well as idiomatic expressions. That's kind of one of the biggest things, right? Like you knock that one out of the park, for example, like when you did a really great job on something. Um, that's just one example. And then the other one is pronunciation. So native speakers in any language, they tend to reduce aspects of their speech, right? So if I say, for example, what are you going to do today? I'm not saying, what are you going to do today? No native speaker would talk like that, but rather, what are you going to do today? Right? Or what are you doing today? Right? So those kinds of reductions make it very difficult for non-native speakers who don't have a lot of experience listening to authentic speech to understand, right, in general. So you end up having something that is perhaps a little bit more staccato, a little bit less fluid, once again, depending on the context and depending on the average level. So, to answer your question more directly, yes, absolutely. There is a large difference on average between native versus non-native use of the English language.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And you mentioned pronunciation. In my opinion, among all the languages I've studied, English has the hardest pronunciation. Like
Really?
yeah, especially with the. I mean, of course, Chinese is a little bit challenging now. Maybe
Hmm.
it can compete, but
Hmm.
in comparison with the other ones, like so many vowels that I believe
Hmm.
that most of people cannot even distinguish them. Like
Hmm.
they are similar, and we end up pronouncing them the same because we don't hear this huge difference. Probably for a native speaker, there is a huge difference between them. And
Hmm.
I wanted to know, like you have very good accent in almost every language you speak. And
Hmm.
what tips you have for people who want to improve their accent in English and have a more native like accent?
That's a great question. So perhaps we'll use Brazilian speakers of English as an example. Yeah. So one of the most important things initially is you need to be able to distinguish at the auditory level, obviously, between different sounds. So, for example, being able to distinguish between ah and right? Now, this sound, as in the English word up or but, does not exist in a great many languages, right? It doesn't exist in Portuguese, in Brazilian Portuguese, for example. So when a Brazilian Portuguese speaker wants to say, but, what do they end up saying?
Nasal, right? uh
They say,
uh
yeah, exactly, yeah. So the sound is it's a mid vowel, but your tongue is in a different position than when you say right? It's kind of higher up within the mouth. So one of the things that I would do specifically with a Brazilian Portuguese speaker is I generally use Anki, but you don't have to. But Anki is good when you're doing what's called minimal pair training. So you're training with generally you'll take two words, and there's only one difference in sound between those two words, and you're training the ear to hear the difference. First, you play one word, then you play the other. Generally, what you do is you present both words, and then you'll only play one of them and say, which one do you hear? And until you can faithfully hear every single time the difference between those two sounds, you're going to have difficulty with the pronunciation because you can't pronounce differentiation that you can't hear. And so ear training is actually at the core of pronunciation improvement because you need to be able to distinguish between those different sounds, right? Just like in Portuguese, in multiple dialects of Portuguese, you have sometimes a r with the tongue and sometimes a r in the back. And if you can't distinguish between those two sounds, r versus r, right, then you're going to have difficulty nailing a specific accent of Brazilian Portuguese. And of course, there's one more R in Brazilian Portuguese from São Paulo. They say R, right?
mhm.
Falar, right?
Yeah,
Which is also very, very interesting. It's actually very interesting, very similar to the R in Irish English. It's effectively the same, that same R sound, right? So, when it comes to improving your accent, one of the first things that you need to do in terms of improving your English pronunciation is you need to be able to hear these sounds that don't exist in your language, right? So, vowel sounds, or right? There's no in Portuguese, correct? In Brazilian
yeah,
Portuguese,
correct.
right? But then you also have, certain consonant sounds. The L in Brazilian Portuguese, what does that sound like?
It's like a U, a short U, like we
Usually
say
like a U.
Brazil. Yeah,
Brazil, exactly. So, and many, even though you write an L, you pronounce it like a U. You say
yeah,
Brazil. So many Brazilian Portuguese speakers are not aware that they're actually saying something that sounds more like a U and not an L. So they end up saying English words that end in L with a U sound, which is quite confusing for native speakers of English when they hear that because like, what? I feel instead of I feel, for example, things like that, right? So it's a matter of systematically identifying those mistakes that derive from your language and then working on practicing eliminating those and getting those new sounds down to the point where you don't have to think about them, you just do them, right? And I'm sure you've had experience with this in learning English, correct?
yeah, sure. But I still think that, okay, once English was my first and second foreign language, I still create bad habit of pronouncing some things wrongly. Then it's hard to
Hmm.
change it later.
Hmm.
And and also because I if I would need to teach someone English from scratch nowadays, I probably would start from the pronunciation. Would you do the same? like to avoid creating these bad habits like I did
Mhm.
once it was my first foreign language.
Yeah, that is something that's a point of contention, I would say. Different people will have different ideas about what it is that you should focus on at the beginning. I do believe that it's important to focus on what I call common mistakes. So common mistakes refer not just to common mistakes that English learners globally make, but specifically common mistakes made by speakers of your language. So for any given language A, there will be specific mistakes that are made by almost all learners of another given language B. So, on average, all speakers of Brazilian Portuguese will make these mistakes when learning English. And therefore, and we're talking about grammar mistakes, pronunciation mistakes, vocabulary, false friend mistakes, right? Those are really the three largest categories. It always makes sense to go over those at the beginning, in particular the pronunciation mistakes, to avoid those building bad habits, as you said. Absolutely. Now, whether you should, work on pronunciation for a month before you actually start learning the language, no. In my opinion, no. Pronunciation is something that should be learned along with the language. And at the beginning, the biggest and most important thing is improving your comprehension, your listening comprehension. There's nothing that is more important than that. And so when I work with students, when I work with them, with my bilingual method, then what we do is we'll start with relatively short texts that also have audio presented to them in a bilingual format. And then they will listen to those texts, read along with the translation until they can understand without needing the text, without needing the translation. Once they have trained their ear to be able to hear the individual words and understand, then we can go to a lower level and we can focus on pronunciation aspects, things like, still instead of still, right? Not turning that L into a vowel, etc., etc. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. And but in English, I think there is one more thing regarding pronunciation that can be tricky, especially for Spanish-speaking people, for Brazilians, because we
Mm-hmm.
tend to write to speak more or less how we write. In Portuguese,
Mm-hmm.
not actually. In Spanish, more. And when we see in English, sometimes we see different sounds that will be represented by different letters.
Mm-hmm.
And one combination of letters can have different sounds in different contexts and different words, and it's very confusing. So,
Mm-hmm.
would you recommend people to always learn? For example, we have a flashcard, and you have the
Mm-hmm.
word and the pronunciation.
Mm-hmm.